say, these days global trade compliance can be an essential part of supply chain management. We're going to talk about that today with my guest, Christos Linardakis. He is Senior Counsel for Braumiller Law Group. Christos, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
This is a critical issue. I'd like to start by asking you to give me a little information about your background. How do you come into this subject?
I started in the supply chain business as a freight forwarder for Schenker back in the 80s, which was one of the largest freight forwarding companies. I then worked for small, medium, and multi-billion-dollar corporations, Compaq Computers, Tellabs, Molex, which is part of Koch Industries today, and various other companies. So after 25 years of corporate experience, I joined the Braumiller Law Group as Senior Counsel for global trade compliance and how it ties into supply chain management.
So compliance has been a big part of your experience all along. Clearly you've seen the value of it from day one.
Absolutely. When I sell compliance to any C-suite executive, it's always how you can add to the bottom line and facilitate the supply chain and the movement of the goods across the world. Done properly, it's not a cost to any company, it's typically a profit center.
So you've got a bunch of interesting stories to tell about your experience in the world of global trade compliance, and I'd like to hear a few of them. You have one about goods that end up in an embargoed country. Could you tell that story?
Yes, in that situation, the product was made in the US, federal government came to visit and asked to build a criminal investigation that was undergoing for this particular product. It was critical within the supply chain to be able to prove to the US government where those goods originated and where they ended up. In that specific example, the goods were manufactured here in the US, sold to a distributor in Southwest US. From there went to a distribution hub in Hong Kong, from there to Dubai, and then sold to an end user in Dubai. That end user then re-shipped that product to an embargoed country. When the federal government comes to a company looking for evidence that you were not involved in that type of transaction, the supply chain ties in critical. TMS systems, your IT systems are critical to be able to prove both the financial transactions as well as the touch points at every single country or every single place where those goods stopped. In that situation, trade compliance was able to show that in conjunction with the supply chain department that here's what happened, here was the transaction, and that the goods were outside of our control when that illegal activity occurred.
So theoretically, you're on the hook for where your goods end up, and in a case like this, if you can show that you show due diligence in your operations, you don't have to be implicated in it.
Absolutely. It's a huge mitigating factor, and the proper compliance controls within any company, which is essential to be tied at the hip with supply chain, is absolutely critical in order to avoid that liability. Mm-hmm. Another situation, product was being manufactured, was a new product line looking to be manufactured in China. The product group and supply chain came to us and asked, what was the total landed cost for the product to be built in China? Questions that a trade compliance officer or an attorney outside counsel would ask, and what I asked was, what were the primary markets? The primary market was the US government, and the secondary market was the European Union. Well, most of those government contracts require Buy American Act or Trade Agreements Act. China would not qualify for that. So when you added the fuel surcharges, security charges, the geopolitical risks involved, including port strikes in the West Coast, it was determined that even though there was a higher cost to build in Mexico, the benefit was you had the North American Free Trade Agreement, which qualified for the primary market in the US. The secondary benefit was the fact that Mexico and Europe had a free trade agreement and still do. Therefore, by building in Mexico, you could leverage that free trade agreement, shave 3 to 4% off the cost of the goods sold, which was a competitive advantage. In that case, the company decided to build in Mexico, even though it was slightly higher charge. The market they were looking for was in the US and Europe, and saving on the duties and taxes allowed them that competitive edge. So again, in that example, you're working very closely with supply chain, procurement, and all the other departments.
Yeah. So this was not an example of a reshoring situation. They just decided that they could not even start in China because of what looked like an attractive proposition turned out from the very start not to be.
Correct.
Or impossible.
Correct. And they took the proactive approach in engaging trade compliance. Now that would not happen if trade compliance wasn't jointly with the supply chain group to determine what was coming down the pipeline. That's why it's critical to get that department involved at an early stage.
Yeah. What's the value and importance of free trade agreements in this environment? How can they be taken advantage of, and what do you have to watch out for if you're working under them?
It's absolutely critical from both the supply chain and procurement. When I worked for a computer company, the competitive edge on monitors, profit margins were razor sharp. In building in a certain FTA country, it allowed us to shave off the duties and taxes, which gave us that competitive edge. Another example is the Council of Belgium is here today at this conference, and the reason they're here today is the fact that Brussels has one of the lowest VAT duty rates and taxes going into the European Union. It also has a large port and a deal for distribution within the European Union. You can build a virtual warehouse in Brussels from a customs regulatory standpoint, but have the physical distribution center in a lower cost country like the Czech Republic. Goods come into the European Union as opposed to paying a high VAT, let's say in Sweden or the UK, you're paying a much lower VAT rate going into the European Union through Brussels, and therefore that gives you the competitive edge as well. So again, that's a value-added service that a global trade compliance department can give to supply chain.
That's the upside. At the same time, if you're going to be working under a free trade agreement, you have to make sure that you're meeting all local content requirements. So you have to be very vigilant about that, do you not?
Absolutely. The local content, regional value content, tariff shifts all come into play, tying in with, again, the supply chain group, tying in with procurement, determine the country of origin, and then deciding where to build is instrumental. Most organizations don't realize to engage their global sales and marketing, their procurement to state, okay, our biggest customer is in Israel. US-Israel has an FTA. That gives you the competitive edge of shaving off 6-7%, whatever the duty rate is. Typically, that's going to make or break your deal in getting into a certain customer or a certain country. So leveraging all the FTA agreements now, I think, is taking a very front page view with a lot of executives trying to decrease their cost of goods sold.
Yeah. When it comes to shipping sensitive materials of one kind or another, or whether it's high-tech or military or non-military high-tech abroad, give me a sense of the universe of regulations. How many lists do exporters need to be looking at to make sure that they are not selling to a end user who might show up on one of those things?
The regulatory minefield is what I like to call it. My area of expertise being in international trafficking and arms regulations is critical. When you activate those regulations, you're also looking at the export administration regulations, you're looking at U.S. Customs regulations. When you're moving goods that are controlled under the ITAR, which are for military purposes, your supply chain has to be ironclad tight.
ITAR, international traffic and
arms regulations.
Arms regulations.
And example I could use that, there's a manufacturing license agreement in Mexico where the goods would have to be transported from South Mexico into the U.S. Your supply chain at that point, going via truck, is absolutely critical in the event that unauthorized goods are introduced into the container or the military goods are taken out. In those cases, there are vendors that will actually have containers where you could tell where the pressure has changed, if the environment within the container has changed, which will automatically send an alert to the local authorities in Mexico as well as to dispatch in the U.S. saying that your container has been compromised. When you're looking at the supply chain for military distribution, again, it's absolutely critical from a regulatory standpoint. You're well aware of where your liability is, how to mitigate that liability, and what the laws and regulations are, both from the U.S. standpoint as well as from the receiving country standpoint.
So what advice do you have for companies that are looking to set up a good compliance regime within their operations?
I think there's a split as to where global trade compliance should reside within corporations. The ideal situation is for it to report into the Office of the General Counsel, because typically global trade compliance will uncover sensitive issues within the corporation or supply chain, but at the same time, a dotted line type of reporting or a very close relationship with supply chain group is absolutely critical in building the compliance program. And again, if it's built properly, in every position I've ever held, it's always been a profit center, not a cost center, and also will facilitate the trade. The movement of the goods will be expedited through multiple regimes as far as customs clearance, et cetera, and it will help in both marketing and the customer side.
Christos, I want to thank you so much for helping us to understand some of the benefits of a really good global compliance program and the pitfalls for not having one. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Christos Linardakis with Braumiller Law Group. Thank you very much for watching.